There's been some rumors about what studio Microsoft could acquire next. I'll go through it all on what Microsoft will acquire and why. Let's discuss. Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of 3-Bit Talks of the VGHD show. I'm 3-Bit and we're going to talk a bit about what studios Microsoft will acquire next based on what's already out there and my own knowledge. You guys are going to like this one. I'm going to comb through it all. If you guys like videos like this, be sure to hit that notification bell to be notified when our next video hits. These videos take some time, so it'll be appreciated if you click that like button as well. Now that we got that out the way, let's talk about it.
Let's talk about it.
So this video will be a bit different from my previous videos. Lots of speculation, not a lot of it is confirmed. A lot of my videos I try my best to base on facts already presented, which I will also do here, but this will also be a fun one. So just keep this video in mind with a grain of salt nearby. I will, however, do my best to present realistic scenarios based on acquisition laws and the relationship Microsoft has with the publisher or developer. We're just going to speculate and guess and have a good time trying to predict what's next for Microsoft. Here is a list of studios I think are possible for Microsoft to acquire and other studios which are less likely due to it being public companies. When thinking about acquisitions, there are a variety of things to consider. If I was Microsoft, what would be some of the biggest challenges to consider? Well, is this company privately owned or is it a public company? And what are the differences between a private company or a public company? Bethesda or ZeniMax is a privately owned studio. Ubisoft or even Microsoft, they are public companies. Board members, CEOs, and founders of a public company tends to own a majority of the company through stock percentages, while privately owned companies can't rely on public capital markets. They have to rely on private funding. The main advantage of private companies is the fact that they don't have to answer to shareholders, and they try their best to minimize tax biting when they can, while on the other side, public companies can sell stock or bonds to raise their overall equity, their cash. Private companies don't have to disclose their financial information to anyone. Public companies are required to file their quarterly earnings report to the SEC, which means trading within the US stock exchange market. Most higher ups of a public company try and keep a majority percentage to maintain ownership. So where have we seen these differences? We actually seen these differences with Ubisoft back in 2018. Vivendi was a company Ubisoft had to fight in order to maintain control of their company, which is very common with public company takeovers. Vivendi bought 27.3% of Ubisoft's share capital, and essentially Ubisoft convinced them to sell those shares back to them and not acquire any more within the next 5 years. So by 2022 they should be released from that deal, and Vivendi is released to do whatever they want to them again around that time. There are two ways to take over a public company: a friendly basis, when there is a definitive agreement, or the other one is a hostile basis, where there is no agreement or approval from the board of directors. So if Microsoft tried to acquire a company like Ubisoft under a friendly agreement, they have to seek shareholder approval and then file a proxy statement with the SEC. The proxy statement usually says what the term of the agreement is, what are the financial projections, how much the directors, officers, and major shareholders contain in shares, all that boring stuff. The merging process typically takes 2 to 3 months for consummation, but the discussions of public companies tend to be a lengthy process because you're not dealing with sole ownerships. Bringing some of the acquisitions down of a public company, less likely on my list. If we're looking at a list of studios Microsoft has already acquired, most of them are private companies. The paperwork and process is just a lot easier and convenient for them. For example, Obsidian, Double Fine, Undead Labs, Rare, Compulsion Games, Mojang, and Bethesda are all private companies that they have acquired. So let's use them as a basis for our argument on what studios they will acquire next. And then we'll get into public companies because I don't want to leave them out either. So if you guys don't know, I feature on the Xbox Factor podcast every Thursday with Mr. Boomstick XL and others, and he had a pretty reliable source message him about the acquisition. He has a source that says it'll be a publisher bigger than Bethesda. So let's say this is true and use this as an additional evidence that allows us to cut down some options on varying studios. If I was Phil at this point, I type in privately owned game studios on Google. What are some of the popular privately owned publishers? There is Valve, Bandai Namco, Sega, Bungie, Deep Silver, and Epic Games. They are all privately owned. A Valve acquisition makes sense for a couple of reasons. One, they are private like the other two on my list. Two, Xbox's release event will be in New Zealand on November 9th, where Gabe Newell, the founder of Valve, just declared citizenship in New Zealand. In addition to that, Phil Spencer, head of Xbox, and Gabe Newell, head of Valve, were on a Zoom call together with Jeff Keighley for practice rehearsals, I'm assuming for the Game Awards in December, which, them teaming up together could mean some sort of announcement in December, or maybe, we'll see. How would a Valve acquisition benefit Microsoft? Well, according to Tom's guide, there are references to VR found within Flight Simulator, mentioning Project Scarlett within the code, which is the Series X. Valve is pretty heavy in the VR space with the Valve Index and creating Half-Life Alyx, the VR title, and by Microsoft acquiring Valve, they would have that technology in addition to Steam, where they can push their Game Pass services even further on the PC platform, and they would also have amazing IPs such as Portal, Half-Life, Left 4 Dead, Counter-Strike, and Team Fortress. This purchase is indeed bigger than the Bethesda purchase, and they are a publisher, referencing Boomstick's source. Sega and Bandai Namco. So I put these two together because their acquisition makes sense according to where I think Microsoft is headed next with acquisitions. In February of this year, Phil Spencer stated that Xbox's position in Japan isn't acceptable, and the month before that, in January, he stated that he was satisfied after his trip to Japan. Both of these companies are Japanese based, have amazing IPs, and also are privately owned. With Sega, however, there's a bit more evidence, as there's been a couple of online sleuths of Sega dropping hints. They had employees making an X hand gesture with a box nearby, symbolizing Xbox. The whole conspiracy of the still iconic tweet with the blue Xbox controllers resembling the words Sonic, their friendly relationship, releasing almost all of the Yakuza games on Game Pass, and the timed next gen exclusive deal with Yakuza Like a Dragon only on the Series X for a short amount of time, and the recent Streets of Rage game coming to Game Pass on release day. There's also a history of Microsoft considering to buy Sega when they exited the console race after the failure of the Dreamcast. So I'll also take that old news into consideration here. In terms of IP, Sega owns Sonic, Condemned, which was an Xbox 360 exclusive. Thought I should note that. Bayonetta, Virtua Fighter, Persona, Yakuza, Jet Set Radio, Warhammer, and many more. I don't think Sega has a lineup as strong as it was in the past, but they do have some good titles in there. I'd argue Bandai Namco has some more recent games that are stronger in the review scale and IP. They have the rights to or own properties such as Pac-Man, Elden Ring, Scarlet Nexus, Dark Souls, Little Nightmares, Soul Calibur, the Tekken series, and a ton of Viz Media games, which has titles like Dragon Ball Z, Naruto, Digimon, and One Piece. So with Bandai Namco, they'd be reaching a big piece of the Japanese market because of Bandai's relationship with anime studios. If Microsoft went with Sega, they'd be furthering the relationship they already have, and there's quite a loyal fan base for the Yakuza and Persona games. So what studio is larger than Bethesda, is a private company, and solidifies their relationship with the Japanese market. I say Sega is the most likely purchase because on what's publicly available. Also, Bandai Namco is a little bit more complicated if they were to be purchased by Microsoft, because Nintendo has 3.8 million shares invested in Bandai worth about $186 million. So let's cut that, and Sega seems a lot more likely. Valve would be a fantastic purchase for Microsoft as well, and Gabe Newell is looking to retire his company very soon, so this would be a good time to sell out. So for private corporations, I'd bring it down to Valve and Sega. But what if Microsoft is emboldened and decided to go through the lengthy process of buying a public company? So let's not cast public companies aside, though we do have to consider public companies tend to have a higher revenue growth, so not only is the paperwork going to be more complicated, the cost will significantly be more to acquire that company. So what's bigger than Bethesda and is a public company worthwhile for investment? So here are some: Take-Two Interactive, Ubisoft, Capcom, CD Projekt Red, Koei Tecmo, and Square Enix. This list is pretty long comparatively to the private companies, so we're going to cut out some of these studios based on logic and the evidence presented. So let's begin with these public companies. CD Projekt Red receives millions of dollars from the Polish government because it helps the economy over there. I doubt they would sell to an American company, and they have an extremely high price for little IP. While the Witcher game is amazing and Cyberpunk looks to be incredible, I don't think it'll be a worthwhile investment for Microsoft, so pass. Take-Two Interactive is worth $18 billion and houses the biggest IPs of all time, Grand Theft Auto and Red Dead. The amount of studios underneath Take-Two resembles the ZeniMax purchase from Microsoft, so they stay for a little bit. Ubisoft is one of those purchases where it makes sense to purchase them for the fact to keep them away from Amazon and Google, which Microsoft has already noted that those are their true competitors, and trying to keep them away for their cloud services, with Google having Stadia and Amazon having Luna. Ubisoft isn't that much more money than the ZeniMax deal, with Ubisoft being worth at least $10 billion, and they own some pretty great IPs. Ubisoft has had a pretty great relationship with Xbox lately. Xbox is currently maintaining marketing rights for most Ubisoft games recently, such as Assassin's Creed Valhalla and Watch Dogs Legion. They have a market cap of around $10 to $11.5 billion, not considering premium of the cost rising for a purchase. If we're considering purchases within the public space, a lot of these companies do make sense, so this is also a stay. It stays for now. Koei Tecmo houses some IP such as Dead or Alive, Ninja Gaiden, and Dynasty Warriors, as well as a ton of different Japanese games. Having games based off of anime shows such as Attack on Titan and Fairy Tail, I wouldn't say they have enough original IP to make them a worthwhile purchase, but they do have a lot to solidify their relationship in Japan, but we'll pass on this one. Square Enix is worth $7.26 billion. Similar to Bethesda, houses some amazing IPs such as the Tomb Raider franchise, Kingdom Hearts, Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, and the new Avengers game, though we have to consider the fact that they have a pretty close relationship with Sony, releasing their games exclusively on the PlayStation platforms for quite some time. Their financials have been kind of all over the place. Reported in 2018 that CD Projekt Red is worth more than Square Enix, which is crazy because they only have two substantial IPs, CD Projekt Red, Witcher, and Cyberpunk, which leads me to believe that they'll take a financial deal. They seem to keep taking exclusivity deals from Sony, so I'd leave them open to cash out for their other IPs as well. They'll stay for now, but they're likely to be cut. Capcom is the one I want Microsoft to purchase probably the most. It has some amazing IPs such as Resident Evil, Street Fighter, Monster Hunter, Dragon's Dogma, Devil May Cry, Marvel vs. Capcom, Dead Rising, and so forth, right? Capcom's net worth is around $6.1 billion, and the Resident Evil engine is pretty great. Capcom kind of lowered their shields on multiple occasions for a hostile takeover, leaving their doors open for another company to acquire them, so they can stay in my acquisition list. So what do we have so far? For private companies, we have Sega and Valve, and for public companies, we have a bit more: Square Enix, Capcom, Ubisoft, and Take-Two Interactive. So now let's cut down these public companies even further through analysis. If I were Microsoft, I'd want to get the most out of my investment for a public company, and that would leave Take-Two, Ubisoft, and Capcom. Take-Two repeatedly hits the financial charts, with Grand Theft Auto 5 being the most purchased game of all time, and it houses some incredible physics engine technologies for their games. The price of Take-Two, however, is pretty massive, and besides Grand Theft Auto and Red Dead, you wouldn't be making big money on their other titles as much versus Ubisoft and Capcom, where you can get a lot more IP. And they also house some incredible technology, Ubisoft and Capcom, that you would own, and it would be substantially cheaper than Take-Two Interactive. So you have to consider Microsoft wanting to expand Game Pass, having enough content on their services, and while you can argue Take-Two can bring a pretty big install base with their sports games, GTA 6, so can Ubisoft and Capcom on a much earlier basis for a lot cheaper. It makes less sense for Grand Theft Auto 6 or a new Red Dead to be exclusive within the Xbox ecosystem. It just seems less likely for them to purchase Take-Two at this point. So I'm going to cut out Take-Two, leaving just Ubisoft and Capcom now for the public companies. Ubisoft has a net worth of $3.63 billion, while Capcom has a net worth of about $1.1 billion. If I had to choose between these two companies, I'd choose Capcom. They have more IPs than Ubisoft, they're cheaper than Ubisoft, and you'd have Japanese game titles which fill once. So they stay and Ubisoft goes. So what about Square Enix? 3-bit, you may be asking. Microsoft was actually very close to buying Square Enix in 1999. They've done some deals here and there, with Tomb Raider being an example, which Sony fans bashed Xbox for, threatening the voice actor with death threats, and barely said the same thing for the time exclusive Spider-Man deal. Don't even get me into that. I don't think a Square Enix acquisition is likely, and here's why. Sony owns $15.6 million of shares in Square Enix's stock, and I don't think Square would want to ruin that relationship with Sony, leaving just Capcom, which has done exclusive deals with Microsoft before, like Capcom partnering with Microsoft for Dead Rising 4. And they've shown they wanted to sell in the past. So for a public company, you have Capcom, and a private company, you have Valve and Sega. So we have gone through the points on why it's down to these three. Can we cut it down even further on what Microsoft is most likely to choose? I am now Phil Spencer. Let's try and figure this out. So this area is pretty hard, but again, I'm leaning toward it being a private company based on Microsoft's history of acquisitions and how much easier it is to maintain a private division versus a public one. So that would lead to Valve and Sega, which are the private companies. So now you ask, out of these two, which would benefit Microsoft the most? I'd have to say Valve. Microsoft wants to grow the user base of Game Pass, and if they combine Game Pass onto Steam, I have a feeling it would grow their user base substantially. They'd own some of Valve's VR technology and house some pretty amazing IPs at the same time. While the Valve purchase doesn't grow the Japanese market like Sega, what they can do instead is continue to make deals with Sega without having to acquire them. So what's left? Lastly, it's Valve for the private company and Capcom for the public company. I don't think I want to cut this even further, but if I had to guess between Capcom and Valve, I'd have to say Valve, because there's been no mumblings about Capcom, and the fact that they're public means they have to disclose the acquisition to the public within 4 days of the agreement, and we haven't heard anything like that from them. So final answer would have to be Valve. What do you guys think the next studio purchase will be? Did I make some good points here? Do you totally disagree? If you think I'm wrong, comment down below, let me know, and don't forget to subscribe for more content from the Video Games HD. I'm 3-Bit, signing off. Have a good one.